Welcome to a deep dive that might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about church.
Ooh.
Today, we're exploring an excerpt from an article, and the title is pretty bold.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
It's called The Dechristianization of the Church.
Wow. Okay, so right off the bat.
And this author does not hold back.
No
I
kidding.
mean, have you ever felt like
Yeah.
the modern world and traditional faith are kind of on this, collision course?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that tension is definitely there.
Well, that's what this author tackles head on.
I'm intrigued.
So we're going to uncover how all these forces swirling around us might be pulling the church away from its original purpose.
Okay.
And maybe even ask ourselves, are some of our modern worship styles actually contributing to the problem?
That's a fascinating question.
It's not just about, empty pews on Sunday morning.
Right.
This is about the essence of faith and
Yeah.
how it's being reshaped
Yeah.
by all these forces around us.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this author connects the dots between those societal changes and, the evolution or maybe even devolution of the church itself.
Oh, absolutely. And, one of the things that really jumped out at me was this idea of modernity.
Right.
And they're not just talking about a historical period.
Always.
They're talking about a mindset,
Yep.
an approach to life that really prioritizes the new over the traditional.
Hmm.
Which, when you think about it, kind of clashes with the whole idea of faith being rooted in these ancient practices and beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. That's a head-on collision right there.
But they go even deeper.
Okay.
They claim that this embrace of all things new and shiny has brought with it kind of a dark side.
Oh,
This loss of shared identity, this sense of isolation,
Yeah.
almost like we've traded a tight-knit community for just this individualistic pursuit of, stuff.
interesting.
And they don't hesitate to link that to some pretty heavy consequences.
Oh, wow. Like what?
Like, the breakdown in our relationships,
No,
this general feeling of emptiness.
I could see that.
So, okay, the world's changing,
Yeah.
and not necessarily for the better.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a little controversial.
Okay, let's see.
The author believes that this spirit of modernity has actually infected the church itself.
Wow. Okay.
They point to things like constant theological disputes,
Uh-huh.
corruption within religious institutions,
Yeah.
and even some specific examples that I wasn't super familiar with, like this idea of Masonic influence in Catholicism.
Yeah, the Masonic influence that the author mentions is really referring to these conspiracy theories
Oh, okay.
about the Freemasons kind of infiltrating the Catholic Church. And it's important to note that, these claims are highly disputed
Yeah.
and they lack historical evidence,
Right.
but they do illustrate the author's broader point
Okay.
about modernity constantly trying to reshape tradition.
So even though the specifics of that example are debated, the author's using it to show how this drive for the new can really erode long-held beliefs and practices,
Yeah.
even in the church.
Right.
And they're saying that's pulling the church away from its core mission.
And speaking of mission, the author has a very specific view of what the church's true purpose should be.
Oh.
They describe it as this community intensely focused on spiritual growth and preparing for the afterlife. Almost like this close-knit family
Yeah.
supporting each other on this journey towards something bigger than themselves.
And this is where they start to throw some shade at modern churches.
Oh.
Right. They're saying that instead of focusing on that spiritual journey, so many churches are trying to be everything to everyone. It's like social clubs,
Uh-huh.
therapy sessions,
Right.
even schools.
Okay.
And while those things might have their place,
Sure.
the author is arguing they've overshadowed the primary reason for going to church,
Yeah, what is that?
connecting with the divine.
Something with the divine.
And there's actually a pretty powerful quote from the author that sums this up.
Okay, what is it?
Going to church is something we do in worship and for God, not ourselves or man.
Wow, that's powerful. It really does make you think.
Definitely food for thought, but it gets even spicier.
Okay, lay it on me.
The author goes on to critique modern worship styles, particularly in Protestant churches,
Uh-huh.
and they do not hold back.
Okay, I'm ready.
They point to things like light shows,
Okay.
rock bands,
Yeah.
fog machines,
All right, so like the whole shebang.
basically anything that feels like a concert. And they're arguing that it's actually a distraction from true worship.
That's an interesting take.
Have you ever been to a service that felt more like a performance
Oh, yeah.
than a sacred gathering?
I think most of us have at some point, right?
This is exactly what the author's getting at.
Okay.
They believe these modern approaches shift the focus from God onto the individual's experience.
Mm.
It becomes about feeling good, not about reverence and connection with something larger than ourselves.
So they're saying it's become more human-centered than God-centered?
Precisely. And they believe that's a form of rebellion against how God intended us to worship based on Scripture and the traditions that have shaped Christianity for centuries.
Wow. So if all those flashing lights and rock anthems are off the table, what does the author propose as the right way to worship?
That's where they bring in their own tradition, Orthodox Christianity. And they
Wow.
present it as the gold standard, a model for what they believe church should be.
Hmm.
A place where every element is geared towards connecting with the divine.
So no electric guitars, I'm guessing.
Definitely not.
Okay, so what does it look like?
They highlight things like icons, these incredibly detailed religious images.
Uh-huh.
They describe them as windows into heaven, helping people feel connected to the divine and to the history of the faith.
It's a very different approach to worship than what many of us are used to.
And that contrast is intentional.
Okay.
They use this very powerful quote to illustrate their point.
Right. If it could not be found in heaven,
Mhm.
we should not have it at church.
That's a stark statement.
Wow, this author's definitely shaking things up.
Yeah.
I'm already rethinking my own experiences in church.
Me too.
Welcome back. I have to admit that first part really got me thinking.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
The author's take on modernity and its impact on the church is pretty intense.
Yeah, it's a bold stance for sure. But, I think it's important to remember that the author isn't necessarily saying that everything modern is bad.
Right.
They acknowledge that the church has always faced challenges throughout history.
That's true. They did mention that.
Yeah, things like theological debates, even corruption within its ranks.
It's not like the church was some perfect utopia before modernity came along.
Exactly, and I think that nuance gets lost sometimes.
Yeah.
Their point isn't to romanticize the past, but rather to highlight how this spirit of modernity
Right.
has introduced this new set of challenges, this way of thinking that sometimes clashes with the core values of faith. Okay, that makes sense. So if the church has always faced challenges, how does the author think we should navigate them today, especially given this whole cultural shift they're talking about?
Well, they don't offer any simple solutions.
Right.
It's not a self-help book after all.
Yeah.
But they are critical of what they see as the church trying to be all things to all people.
Okay.
They believe that by trying to fill every societal gap,
Right.
becoming a social club,
Uh-huh.
a therapy session, a school,
Yeah.
they're saying the church is diluting its core spiritual mission.
Right. Like that quote we talked about earlier, going to church is something we do in worship and for God, not ourselves or man.
That's a powerful statement.
And it leads us back to the author's critique of modern worship styles,
Right.
which they see as another symptom of this shift away from a God-centered approach.
Uh-huh.
Those light shows, rock bands, fog machines,
Yeah.
they argue that these things ultimately distract from the true purpose of worship. I'm curious, have you ever personally experienced that kind of disconnect during a church service?
Where it felt more like a performance than a truly sacred gathering.
I think most of us have at some point.
Right.
And that tension the author highlights
Yeah.
between wanting to be relevant and engaging for modern audiences
Mm-hmm.
while staying true to the core tenets of faith. It's something that, a lot of denominations are wrestling with.
Yeah.
It's not an easy balance to strike.
No, it's not. It's like there's this constant push and pull between tradition and innovation.
And what's interesting is that this struggle isn't limited to Christianity. We see similar debates happening in other religions and spiritual practices around the world.
Really?
It's a universal challenge, this idea of how to adapt ancient traditions to a rapidly changing world while still preserving their essence.
So for the author, it seems like the answer lies in returning to a more traditional God-centered approach, right?
Yeah.
Taking cues from Scripture and the way the church has historically understood worship. Yes, they believe that those ancient practices hold a wisdom and a power that we've lost sight of in our pursuit of novelty and entertainment. And they use the example of Orthodox Christianity to illustrate this point.
Can you remind me again what makes Orthodox Christianity so different?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, they place a strong emphasis on connecting with the divine through icons, hymns, and prayer.
Okay.
These are practices that have remained largely unchanged for centuries. There's a real focus on ritual and tradition, a sense of continuity with the past.
It sounds like a very different experience from what you might find in a more contemporary church service with its emphasis on personal experience and emotional expression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while the author isn't necessarily saying that those things are wrong,
Right.
that emotional connection can be powerful,
Mm-hmm.
but they do believe that they can distract from the true purpose of worship,
Yeah.
which is ultimately about connecting with God,
Right.
not just with our own feelings.
I'm starting to see the author's point, but I also wonder if we strip away all the modern elements, all the things that make church feel familiar and relatable to people today,
Mm-hmm.
are we risking alienating those who are seeking a more contemporary expression of faith?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And it's a question that each individual in each community has to wrestle with.
Right.
There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Hmm.
But the author's point is to encourage us to think critically about what we're really seeking when we go to church.
Okay.
Are we looking for entertainment and validation, or are we seeking a deeper connection with something beyond ourselves?
That question of, what we're truly seeking,
Yeah.
I think that's at the heart of this whole deep dive, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's so easy to get caught up in the debates about, music styles or the role of the church in society.
Right.
But ultimately, it comes down to our own individual journeys of faith.
It all comes back to that. Yeah. And the author's argument, as provocative as it is,
Yeah.
it really does force us to confront those deeper questions.
It does. They've connected the dots between this spirit of modernity, the changing face of the church, and even the way we experience worship.
It really is all connected.
It's almost like they're saying we've traded a sense of the sacred
Huh?
for something more superficial, like we've lost sight of what it truly means to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
And that loss, they argue, has left us feeling fragmented and unmoored. It's like we're adrift in a sea of individual desires, constantly seeking fulfillment in fleeting experiences and material possessions.
Which is ironic because the author believes that's exactly what the church should be providing an antidote to.
Right.
Instead of mirroring that individualistic culture, they're saying the church needs to reclaim its role as a community focused on spiritual growth and a deeper connection with the divine.
It's interesting to think about how this connects to the author's emphasis on traditional forms of worship.
Okay.
They're not just clinging to the past for nostalgia's sake. They see those ancient practices as a way to tap into something timeless and transcendent.
So it's not just about the rituals themselves, it's about what those rituals represent.
Okay.
This connection to a lineage of faith, a sense of continuity that stretches back centuries.
Precisely. And that connection, the author argues, is something that's sorely lacking in our modern world. We're so focused on the now that we've lost touch with the wisdom and grounding that comes from tradition.
That makes me think about other religions and spiritual practices around the world.
Yeah.
So many of them emphasize rituals and ceremonies that have been passed down for generations. I'm wondering if the author's argument might apply to them as well.
That's a great point. Whether it's, lighting incense at a Buddhist temple or performing ablutions before Islamic prayer or sharing a Seder meal during Passover, these traditions often serve a similar purpose. They connect us to a community, to a sense of shared history, and to something that transcends our individual lives.
So where does this leave us? We've explored this author's pretty radical critique of the modern church
We have.
and their call for a return to a more traditional God-centered approach. But how do we apply these ideas to our own lives, especially if we don't subscribe to the author's specific theological viewpoint?
I think the real value of this deep dive lies in the questions it raises, not necessarily in providing, concrete answers.
Yeah.
It's a prompt for us to reflect on our own spiritual journeys, regardless of our backgrounds or beliefs.
The author challenged us with that powerful statement. If it could not be found in heaven, we should not have it at church.
Right.
It makes you reconsider what truly belongs in a sacred space.
And as we wrap up, I'd like to kind of flip that statement around.
Okay.
And leave you with this final thought. What if there are things we find in heaven? Things like love, compassion, unity, a sense of the sacred that we're not fully embodying in our churches or in our daily lives.
That's a powerful challenge and a beautiful note to end on. It's a reminder that the search for meaning and connection doesn't end when we leave a church service.
Doesn't.
It's an ongoing journey, a deep dive that we're all on together. Thanks for joining us.